Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to God.
Imagine the scene at the synagogue. Imagine the woman who is so infirm that she's bent over. I'm not even sure if I can make that position look right, but something like this. Have you ever seen somebody who is so completely bent over like this? And the fathers say all she can see is the ground. Poor woman. She might only be able to see the ground, only might be able to see the earth because of the involvement of the evil spirit. Maybe she can't even lift her prayers to heaven. Who knows? And then Jesus sees her. And without anybody asking him to do anything, he says, "Woman, you are freed of your infirmity." And he lays his hands upon her and heals her. What a marvelous thing to behold. And it's marvelous to behold because we know that Jesus sees us. No matter how bent over, how bowed down to the earth, how spiritually bent over and bowed down to the things of the earth we might be, Jesus saw her, and Jesus sees us too. And he says to a woman, "You are freed." And St. Cyril of Alexandria says this: "This is a speech most worthy of God and full of supernatural power. With the royal inclination of his will, he drives away the disease from her." I believe that Jesus wants to drive away the diseases that afflict us. We hear in this gospel where disease and sickness come from, and it doesn't come from God. It comes from the evil one. Never sit there when you're lying in bed somewhere sick, feeling awful, thinking that God has done this to you. The devil may very well have done this to you, either directly through an evil spirit or indirectly through fallen creation and germs and all of the silly ways that we live our life and expose ourselves to things that we don't even know about. But it's not God who wants you to be sick. It's God who brings healing. Even in our own day and age, still brings miracles. Now, I have no idea at all why some people get miracles and other people, no matter how hard they pray, don't seem to. I have no idea at all, but I know who does. And he says, all things work together for the good of those who love God. So somehow, what the evil one means for our harm, he turns and uses for our good, for our salvation, for our blessedness. And I don't pretend to understand why God allows suffering in this world. Why God would allow Satan to afflict this poor woman so much that she's bowed and bent over like this. Can't even look anybody in the face anymore. But look what God did in her case. Look what God used her suffering for. To show everybody that God is with us. And to show everybody that he was God. Only God can do that, by the way. Only God can heal somebody miraculously like that. It's very difficult sometimes to believe in God's goodness when we see suffering. When we suffer ourselves or when we see other people suffering. It's a very difficult question to answer. But if you've experienced the love of God in any way, at any time, if you've experienced his goodness, if you've experienced the love of Jesus Christ, you know that you can trust the answer to the question of suffering to him. And moreover, you also know that without fail and without any exception, whether you feel it or not, he is with you and with each one of his children when they suffer. He said, I am with you always, even to the end of the world, even to the very end of the age, or even to the very end of your life. He is with you. But we don't always feel it. And in our two-dimensional world, so to speak, we certainly don't always see the reason. I had a friend who worked on a suicide crisis line in England. And that was the world's first crisis line. And it began because a man whose uncle was a bishop in the Church of England summoned him to his bedside as he lay dying and said, you must become a priest. And this guy's like, I don't want to be a priest. You must become a priest. Promise me now. Promise me you will become a priest. So what's he going to do? So he promises his uncle before he dies that he will go into the ministry. So sure enough, he enters the priesthood of the Church of England and eventually is ordained. But he said, I had no sense of call from God, just this promise that I'd made to my uncle. And the first service he was called to do was the funeral of a 13-year-old girl. And this poor girl had hung herself. And the situation was that she had started a period, didn't know what it was, and thought that in some way she had caused it. And he said, as I was doing that funeral, as I was at the graveside, I made her a promise. And I said, little girl, I promise you, nobody else will have to go through what you went through without having somebody that at any time, completely confidentially, they can pick up the phone and call. You did not die in vain, little girl. And he left the parish ministry, though he always stayed a priest, and he founded this organization called the Samaritans, which was the world's first crisis line, and has inspired many other crisis helplines around the world. And through its ministry to people in their darkest times, have saved thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. Now, was that little girl's death any the less tragic? No, it wasn't. But did God bring goodness, in her case, incredible goodness, out of someone who saw her suffering and decided to do something about it? It's a great mystery why God allows people to suffer like that little girl suffered, like the woman in the gospel suffered. But we know who we can trust that mystery to. Jesus heals the woman. And immediately, all the religious people are wagging their fingers and shaking their heads because he's broken the Sabbath rule, or so they think. Because he's done something. I mean, obviously, you're working pretty hard if you heal somebody. And the synagogue leader says, don't do this on the Sabbath. If you want healing, come on the other 6 days of the week. And of course, Jesus points out that he's being a hypocrite. He says he doesn't understand the Sabbath. And as Jesus says elsewhere, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he points out that even in the Jewish law, with all of its exactitude about what you can and mostly can't do on the Sabbath, even under Jewish law, you can water your animals. You can lead them to water. And so if you care for an animal, says Jesus, how much more does God want to care for his people on the Sabbath? But I think we have a problem. I don't think that we understand the Sabbath either. Perhaps not much more than the Jews understood the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath is meant to be a day of rest and a day of honoring God. In the book of Exodus, where the Sabbath was instituted by God, God says this: "Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. No work may be done then, either by you or your son or daughter, or your male or female slave, or your beast, or by the alien who lives with you." Reminds me of a TV show or two. "In the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." We all need rest. As human beings stuck in a finite world with bodies that wear out on a regular basis, we all need rest. And it's a hallmark of systems of government that don't acknowledge God, that they don't allow people to rest, that they don't allow people to be off on Sundays. I think it was it the communists that started a 10-day working week? I think Napoleon had a similar idea. And it's a week, that it just assumes people can go and go and go and go and go and go and go. And that, of course, is not God's plan. God's plan is that we rest, that we worship, and that in rest and worship we find the rejuvenation we need to do the things that God has called us to do. I think that if church was more restricted, less available, if there wasn't a Catholic church every 15 minutes along the road, maybe we would take coming to church a little more seriously. St. Gregory Palamas says that St. Thomas, our St. Thomas, lost his faith when he was away from the rest of the disciples. He found it again when he was back with them, but he lost his faith when he was away from them. And if we are away from our other fellow disciples, we run into the same danger. If such a good man as Thomas said, "I can't believe," we run into that danger too. Somewhere in the Old Testament it says, how can somebody be warm alone? You need the other members of the disciples to be warm, to warm you with their faith. You know, to Jewish people, the greeting, the wish, the one thing they pray for and ask for is shalom. And shalom means peace. And we wish and pray for the same thing. There's at least 4 times in every divine liturgy when I turn around and say, peace be to all. In Hebrew, that's shalom. But it means more than peace. It means wholeness. It means rest. It means nothing's missing and nothing's broken. You can be at peace because you have rested. And if you ever talk to a Jewish person about how they celebrate the Sabbath, it's a completely different level than what most of us Christians live on Sunday. And it means so much more to them. They light these special candles the evening before to mark the beginning of the Sabbath. And I saw a rabbi do this once. And the joy on his face as he saw the Sabbath light was wonderful. I think we take our own joyful light way less seriously than we should do. Because he was somebody who really found the light of God, the light of the Sabbath, to be a joy on a whole different level than we know. We have a lot to learn from our Jewish brothers and sisters. And in the letter to the Hebrews, we hear that there remains a rest for the people of God. And the writer tells us to labor to enter that rest. Sometimes you have to work hard, you have to be diligent, you have to labor to enter into God's rest. Even if you want to enjoy a nice day off, you've got to plan ahead what you're going to do sometimes to make sure that you're awake in time, to make sure that you have what you need. It's very difficult to rest sometimes without properly preparing it. And if we want to enter into God's rest, the letter to the Hebrews reminds us that we must labor at it and be diligent about it. That means making sure we can come to church, making sure that we give time to prayer, making sure that we give time to the people that God has placed in our lives so that we can help them find rest and nourishment and relaxation, and so that they can do the same things for us. The fathers say that if your heart feels dry to God, if you don't feel the presence of God, then that's the time to come to church. Even if it's a weekday, come to church and look at your brother and sister who is aware of God. Sometimes you meet these people. There was a guy in our seminary in England, and he just shone. He was just such a good, solid guy. You could almost see the halo around him. And he would just shine and smile all the time. And it always lifted me up to see, as he is now, Father Philip when he prayed. And if I was feeling that my own prayers weren't going any higher than the ceiling, all I needed to do was look at now Father Philip and see him praying. And as the fathers tell us, to see your neighbour's warmth brings warmth to you. And St. Gregory Palamas, I'll close with him. He says this: "Let us, brethren, meet together and often come to God's church, where all who are truly godly are present, and never stay away. When each of you enters the church, look for the more godly of those within, whom you can recognize just by seeing how they stand in attentive silence. Watch for those who are more pious and God-fearing than the rest, and go and attach yourself to them, and attend upon God with them. When you come out after the dismissal on the Lord's day and are at leisure from earthly work for the sake of him whose day it is, carefully search to see if there is an imitator of the apostles who mostly stays indoors, longing for God with silent prayer, psalmody, and other suitable practices. Approach such a person and enter his small room with faith, as though you were entering a heavenly place containing the Spirit's sanctifying power. Sit down beside him and stay with him as long as possible. Talk to him about God and divine matters, asking questions, humbly learning, and appealing for help through prayer. If you do this, I know for sure that Christ will invisibly come to you, give peace within the thinking part of your soul, increase your faith, strengthen your steadfastness, and in due time set you among his chosen in the heavenly kingdom. If we are faithful to give ourselves the rest and the worship that God prescribes on a Sunday, he will give us a place where he rests in eternity and where we can rest with him. And maybe, just maybe, as we honour him in church, we too will experience miracles on the Sabbath, just like the woman did in the Gospel. Glory to Jesus Christ.